Good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents, a new offering on Village TV. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization committed to peace, social justice, economic equality, and a clean environment. For the duration of the lockdown, instead of its usual 2 meetings a month, Concerned Citizens will broadcast 2 programs a month on this channel. Our programs will feature films, lectures, and debates on topics related to our mission. We hope you enjoy today's program.
Welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. My name is Suzanne Modell, and I'm chair of the Concerned Citizens Program Committee, which is the group that plans and coordinates these broadcasts. Today, our committee is pleased to present Kevin O'Leary, author, journalist, and political scientist. Today, Dr. O'Leary will offer his 2020 post-election analysis. Welcome, Kevin O'Leary.
Hi, Suzanne. Hi, Concerned Citizens. It's so nice to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Dr. O'Leary graduated Phi Beta Kappa from UCLA and received his PhD from Yale. His journalistic career included work at Time Magazine, the Pasadena Star News, and the LA Times. His academic career has included teaching at the Claremont Colleges and Chapman, where he is currently a lecturer. He is the author of 2 books, Saving Democracy, A Plan for Real Representation in America, and Madison Sorrow, Today's War on the Founders and America's Liberal Idea. The Concerned Citizens Program Committee has waited until now, November 30, 2020, to record this broadcast because it takes time to gather enough data to render an election comprehensible, especially one as hotly contested as this one. We believe enough time has now passed that a preliminary assessment is possible, and we are very pleased that Dr. O'Leary has agreed to do this for us. To begin, he will provide a 20 to 25-minute overview of his understanding of what happened and why. We will then move to a Q&A. Several concerned citizens have provided us with questions. But first is opening remarks. Dr. O'Leary.
All right. Thank you very much, Suzanne. Well, we had such interest. We had the highest turnout in a long, long time in American politics. So it showed both sides were very interested in this election, and it was tremendous turnout given a pandemic. And I look at this election and say kudos to the manager of the Biden campaign and the Biden team for focusing and figuring out just how to win all those swing states that they needed to win. They did a tremendous job. And it was interesting after the election when the polling mistakes were seen and people were embarrassed as the public polls were off in numerous states, that the people inside the Biden campaign, for example, one man who advised them on the Latino vote in Florida, who's based up at UCLA, he said their numbers, they knew it was going to be tight in all these states. They did not believe the public polls, both from their on the ground observations and their own internal polling. And the Trump people knew that they were close too in some of these states. And so, great job by the Biden team all the way through. It was unfortunate about Florida that the message about Biden being a socialist got through to the Cuban community, and somehow he's now best friends and maybe he's a patron saint of Castro's, which is all foolishness. And it seems absurd to me that the Democrats couldn't counter that narrative with something about how Trump has been just so cozy with Putin and the North Korean dictator, et cetera. So are you just concerned about this phantom socialism or something real where we're talking about authoritarianism, which means they could take away your rights and your liberties, which is what you're worried about? The Democrats have never been, as a party, and never, you can make a good argument, and I think we should, as liberals, on the liberal side, that the Democrats are nowhere near socialists, and America has never had what's the dangerous thing is a Marxist-Leninist ideology that has a big following, where you want to have a dictator on top of a communist party. And that's why America fought communism all these years. What we do have, and I'll talk about this in my books about it, is the threat from an authoritarian right. And the aftermath of the election was deeply disturbing, with McConnell still and most of the Senate Republicans refusing to publicly congratulate Biden and calling it a win, bowing to Trump. So, that's where we are with that election. With the underneath election, we did not get the blue wave that people thought we might. In Southern California, we can see how that was with Harley Ruda on the coast. The Republicans wanted that seat back. That was a narrow victory for him. And so if you look at it, Mike Levin and, Katie Porter, they were the two strongest of the Democrats of the four that got in. And they came back and they won convincingly again. But the Republicans put up good candidates and put in money and worked hard. And, we came up short. And I think that happened with a lot of the campaigns across the country, given the different districts and so forth, that it was a surprise that we lost ground in the House, and disappointing. But maybe we overperformed. And then in the Senate, it was deeply disappointing for the Democrats to lose out in narrow races across so many places, including the seat in Maine that, a lot of people thought was for sure Collins was out, and that it looked like we had North Carolina for the polling all those times. But we did get Arizona, we did get Colorado. We hung on in Michigan, and people in California, were busy phoning other states, and people around the country were busy doing the activism they could during the pandemic. So Democrats turned out big, unfortunately for the Dems. The Republicans turned out as well. And that's interesting. And I don't have the data. I'm sure there'll be people working on this about the new voters that Trump got. I'd be interested to know, of the new voters that the Trump team was able to bring in and register, how many of them were far to the right. Okay. And so let me segue to my book. I'll show you my cover. This book came out in May. It's from Pegasus. You can find the link on Simon & Schuster. It's called Madison Sorrow, Today's War on the Founders and America's Liberal Ideal. Okay, so what the book is about is to make an argument that American politics has forever been about liberals and conservatives. And we've both been under an umbrella of kind of common ideology, of common values, that when people came to the US and founded the country, they rejected the old world and founded a new world. And the new world was based on that rejection of the old world. And the old world was based on four values: privilege, hierarchy, radical inequality, and exclusion. And those are the values of an aristocratic or a feudal society. Now, unfortunately, remnants of that thinking have survived in American politics. And every once in a while, they raise their ugly head. And the two remnants, so let me back up. So the liberal ideology that the founders have of trying to set up a middle-class society based on liberty, equality, and democracy, that runs from John Locke, who inspires the founders, through Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, Washington, you name it, through Tocqueville, all the way through Lincoln, and from Lincoln to the modern liberal presidents. And people like Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon, especially on the domestic side, they bought into that. That was part of their ideology. They were liberals in this philosophic sense. The bad part of our politics always has been from the right. We saw it in the Civil War, so that the slaveholders' ideology is a remnant of feudalism, right? It's having a caste society. It's having some people on the bottom that have no rights and do all the dirty jobs. And under slavery, no wages, and an awful situation. So it's very much that the plantation elite did look back fondly on Europe. And that was a feudal oasis as the rest of America, the North and the West, that Tocqueville talks about in Democracy in America, surged ahead. And in the climactic Civil War, right? The North wins. But it took a long time. And it's very interesting that, to bring back things to our current situation, that Biden chose to go to Gettysburg for one of his best speeches of the campaign in October. And he talked about bringing the country together. And, you know, it was an ode to Lincoln's famous speech, of course. But in hindsight, looking now at how entrenched the Republicans are and how hard they will probably fight Biden's election and agenda in a way that traditionally wasn't the case, it's clear we're still in this cold war. And Gettysburg, you know, the real Gettysburg, was in 1863. And that was the turning point of the war. It stopped the Southern advance. It stopped the illiberal assault on the North. But it took then, you know, another 2 years of hard war by Grant and Sherman and the rest to defeat the Confederacy. Okay. So I think, in a sense, we're still in this situation where this reactionary right has a lot of power. And it's a dangerous situation for American democracy. The other side of our illiberal brain is the plutocrats who first came about in the Gilded Age and now the Second Gilded Age, who, to put it, you know, in a pithy manner, believe that their liberty matters much more than anybody else's liberty, right? And in Trumpian terms, their liberty trumps everybody else's. They should be able to do whatever they damn please because they're super rich. And those ideas have an intellectual pedigree that's important. It's a social Darwinism of a guy named Herbert Spencer, who was a social Darwinist before Darwin, and had a very brutal idea of that basically the poor and the underclass should just fade away and die, almost, maybe not almost literally, so that their gene pool was gone. And then the privileged better classes at the top would intermarry, and gradually we would become better and better souls. And then there would be no need for government because everybody would be so good. Well, of course, Madison and Hamilton didn't believe that was going to be possible, and it's crazy. But the legacy of that thinking comes ahead with the famous novels of Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, and her dark vision of Nietzsche, dark, crude version of Nietzsche that's rejected by modern scholarship. And she again divides society into the better, the worthy, and the unworthy. And then F.A. Hayek's very important, the famous economist who wrote Road to Serfdom, and he came up with this new way of saving capitalism by basically saying any government that's larger than a pinhead will quickly slide into socialism. So there was no middle ground. There was no middle path for Hayek. It was either very minimal government of the 1890s, which was basically in the US, you know, the post office. It wasn't much else in the military. There wasn't much government in 1890, and the plutocrats liked that. And having a modern welfare state like Franklin Roosevelt set up and all of Western Europe and the US today has. And that's never veered off into totalitarian hell like Hayek predicted, right? He said that's basically your own option. And as an economist, he's very good. He's very good about saying that you can't have a centrally controlled market. I mean, you have to have a market system. In other words, you can't have a centrally controlled situation. You have to have a private sphere, right? So that people have resources. Arthur Schlesinger, other liberals recognize this. Charles Lindblom, one of my mentors, recognized this. But there's no reason why Americans as Democrats should not be able to, you know, put in rules and regulations about the economy as they wish. That was Thomas Paine's vision way back when. We should, if we have the government that comes up from us and not from above, then we should be able to have, you know, education for poor kids. We should be able to have a welfare system and social security for the aged. I mean, Thomas Paine was like 150 years ahead of the New Deal, and he predicted both of those things. Now, when did this come together to come up to where we are? Well, a lot of us are old enough to remember Barry Goldwater accepting the 1964 nomination. The two wires I talked about, if you think of it as two streams of thought or two electric cords, the plantation slavery mentality, the racism of the Old South, that was, of course, there was racism across America, but that authoritarian political culture was isolated in the Old South from 1865 to 1965. And it only loosened because of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. But at the same time it did, the other side, which had always been in the Republican Party on the far right, right, in 1900 to 1960, the Republican Party is a broad tent. There's moderates, there's progressives, there's all kinds of folks. There's conservatives, regular traditional conservatives, and there's hard right people who don't believe in government. Eventually, the hard right people take control. Why? Because the Southern racists who were in the Democratic Party joined the Republican Party. The two wires crossed. There's a famous meeting where George Wallace sends a messenger, and it's the opening scene of my book. And there's actually a picture that goes along with it that was recorded by a live photographer. There's a secret meeting, not so secret in the sense it was recorded on film, but it was on top of the Mark Hopkins Hotel overlooking the San Francisco Bay. And James Martin comes from Wallace, and Wallace messages, "I want to be your vice presidential candidate," which is like crazy because it's a Republican convention and Wallace is a Southern Democrat. But Wallace saw the future. And Wallace's campaigns for the presidency in the late 60s, early 70s, those chart the course of what Trump was able to do in 2016. Take the South and go to the upper Midwest. The problem was when those two sides came together within one political party, that had never happened in American politics. That's a new thing, to have the two illiberal tendencies inside one party. They pushed out all the moderates. So a long time ago, we had Howard Bakers, we had, Dirksen, you had all kinds of people you could name, Bob Dole, all the way through John McCain, right? John McCain's like the last of the famous traditional conservative breed. People like Jeff Flake have been forced out. Many people who are kind of straddling the line, don't really like Trumpism, but they've been pulled in and they kind of have to mouth it to get elected. They've retired. And so now the elected party of Republicans, especially in Washington level and in the state governments, not as much in the county level in terms of people who are, the people that counted the votes, the people that did that this time, they stayed true to the Constitution principles. But the people at the upper echelons, closer to the donors, they have become reactionaries. Okay. And that's what's happened to American politics. We used to have liberals, conservatives. It was easy to work together. And the title of the book comes from the idea that Madison's system of constitutional governance has worked for centuries. It works quite well, but it depends on both parties being of similar values. And right now, the reactionaries, like McConnell, have marched so far to the right that they have rejected conservatism. And there's three ways to understand what a reactionary is versus a conservative. Number one, a conservative believes in the Constitution, defends the Constitution, speaks like Romney did about the results of the election. Nobody else came close to Romney's clear, easy statement about what was going on. Number two, conservatives, traditional conservatives, believe in government. They do not hate government. They do not hate the national government. They recognize the need for a functioning national government that is run by people who are well-trained and good at what they do. Go read Edmund Burke, Reflections on the Revolution of France. He never disses government. He's afraid that the French revolutionaries will mess it up because they don't know anything about government. That's why he hates them so much. And then finally, traditional conservatives believe in racial justice and the march toward that. And the Civil Rights Act passed because they were the party of Lincoln and they worked with Lyndon Johnson to get it done. Right now, people who are the reactionaries do not, are not committed to racial justice. They're open to undermining it, and some of them are outright racist. And it's unfortunate, but that's where we are. Those three ways are good ways to see the difference between the three. And that doesn't mean there's not millions of conservatives in the population. The tragedy of all this is there's millions of conservatives in the population. Some of them came out and voted for Joe Biden. right? But not enough to have for this election in 2020 to be a fundamental rejection of Trumpism. Instead, Trumpism still lives. Trump's gone, but I maintain that the problem is the reactionary turn of the Republican Party, which happened from especially Gingrich on in the 1990s to now, and has accelerated every election. And the donor class and the alt-right folks and the politicians who know they have to move right to get elected, that's what's happened, and they're in control. And the conservatives, the regular conservatives, the people who are like Mitt Romney in the population, do not have representation right now, which means the Democrats have a hard situation they're in. They're going to have to win more. They're going to have to, for this to get out of this cul-de-sac, in a sense, we have to win dramatically a couple elections in a row for the Republicans to see the light. Now, demographically, time's on the Democrat side if the demographics hold. But some of the questions that people asked were, where did the Latino vote? Where did the Black vote in terms of men? So things didn't do as well as the traditional diagnosis, predictions on the liberal side might say. And so I'll close with this. My book closes with the argument that when these two threads came together, that we're in a reactionary revolution. And what I mean by that is America's had a long liberal revolution. Most revolutions happen within 10 or 20 years. And they start off gradually and they get more, extreme, and then they finally get violent, like the famous French and Russian revolutions, and then they ebb, and then things continue. With ours, we did the moderate part, but nobody would call the people that founded our country radical in the same sense as Robespierre or Lenin. They were radical in their ideas. They were radical about democracy, but they weren't extreme in their political actions of trying to kill their opponents. And so our revolution stayed in a moderate stage, and it's been a gradual moderate revolution over time to try to get at the equality that we promised at the beginning of the country. And it gets violent in the Civil War, right? In Lincoln's leadership, we succeed. And then it continues from 1865 on. And you can think of all of the 20th century as a great movement, even to now, of inclusion. So instead of exclusion, we've included people on the liberal side. Instead of massive inequality, we have the right to question inequality. Instead of hierarchy always being accepted, liberals say we can think about that. Is there another way to set society up and organizations than a tremendous hierarchy? And privilege. How much privilege do we want to give people? Because the greatness of the American Revolution at the start, in time of Jefferson and Jackson, was that we had this incredible equality of socially, economically, and politically, unlike any time in in world history back to Athens. Now we've opened that up to include women, Blacks, Latinos, minorities, gays, et cetera, trying to do that inclusion and make society like that. But the pushback on inequality is rooted in our founding soul. On the reactionary side, though, it's a reactionary revolution because from Gingrich on, as the two threads took over the party, from Reagan on, Reagan was kind of a split mind of the two. He wasn't totally committed in a reactionary way, the way Gingrich and the people after Gingrich have been. You get to Gingrich and things accelerate, and that's when the extremists take over, right? And then what happens? In a classic revolution, which is what's happening now, the people who were the most radical continually get outflanked. And one of my favorite stories here is Eric Cantor, who was the next in line, number 2 in the House behind John Boehner. He is ousted by a Tea Party person in a primary. And then you see Trump come along and outflank Ted Cruz, who's quite right-wing. And Trump takes things, right? And now we'll see what happens after this. But in this, we're in a classic period of a reactionary revolution where and Trump at the end is so fundamentally and it's so blatantly attacking the very essence of democratic rule, where he's questioning the outcome of an election that he clearly lost, and nobody's calling him out, or not enough people clearly on the Republican side. That's super authoritarian. It's right out of a Latin American dictator's playbook. So we are in the midst of this reactionary revolution, and we'll see whether we can stop it and halt it. And that's kind of the danger we're at.
Okay, all right.
Okay, so I'll stop there, and
Okay,
we'll
yes,
take some questions on the election.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's try some of the. A lot of people asked about the characteristics of different types of voters, and you touched on it, but then you didn't get to the heart of it. So, with respect to blacks, for example, or Hispanics, we were rather surprised at the proportion that supported Trump. Do you have some thoughts as to why the minorities' votes seem to have been higher than expected for
Yeah,
Trump?
on the Trump side, I think is a couple things. One, you have to, with minority groups, we know this in California. We know this in Orange County, for example. Like, not all Asians are the same, right? No, there's Koreans, there's Vietnamese, there's Filipino, right? So you have to know about which group and its particular history. So if you look at the Cubans in South Florida, that's a particular group, fleeing Castro's communist regime. They've always been very anti-communist. So they're open to that kind of appeal. The Puerto Ricans, you would expect, maybe we should have done a better job, the Democrats, of appealing to them, given how badly Trump had done on the massive hurricane. He didn't want to acknowledge that they were American citizens, and he did nothing. It was terrible, just disgusting. In Texas, I've read a piece that was quite good about the Latino community in the Rio Grande that went more for Trump. It looks like two things happened. One, those people have been here a long time. They think of themselves as American. It's very Hispanic, but they think of themselves almost, and this was in like a New York Times or Washington Post piece, they think of themselves as white, right? They don't think of themselves as new immigrants, and they don't think of themselves as colored. They don't think of themselves as brown. And on top of that, so those are two geographic things. On top of that, you've got the situation of Trump message on the economy and his, story, quote, story of business success appeals to some of the Latino men, and his kind of macho attitude, just kind of that. And I think also some of the, you're a prisoner of your history. So some people in the Hispanic community that have come from Latin America have been more familiar with kind of strongman type leadership, right? And maybe they're more open to that. That doesn't mean that Democrats didn't do extremely well in Arizona and Nevada and California with younger Latino activists. But I guess it was a mistake to think that the Pete Wilson example from the early 90s of the anti-immigrant message he did in his gubernatorial campaign then doomed him from the Latino vote from then on. It's a little more mixed now.
Okay, all right,
okay.
that's fine.
That's on the Latino vote.
Okay, let me ask you a little about ticket splitting, which you did mention. Maine was the only state that elected Biden and a Republican senator, but in several places, including Orange County, as you mentioned, people evidently voted for Biden, but then Republican congresspersons and Republicans, lower down on the ticket. Do you have any sense as to what sort of people tended to be ticket splitters, or what their motivation was? Because I think that's where the Democrats miscalculated.
Yeah, I think the motivation is people that do that kind of buy into the idea of checks and balances, right? And, kind of like, we don't want Biden to do too much, so we'll stop it. And what else about that? I think the Biden campaign was successful in getting a number of people that were more, quote, moderate, more toward the middle of the spectrum to think twice before pulling the vote for Trump. But a lot of them are in the habit of voting Republican, always voting Republican. And one of the key things for concerned citizens to know in terms of political science data that's pretty much agreed on is that we're in a time of trying to think what the lingo is here. It's negative partisanship, that people will put up with a lot from their own party, but because they think the other party is so dangerous, right? Both sides, but especially Republicans, have been taught by Fox News, et cetera, and from Gingrich. I mean, Gingrich did this whole, his language of attacking liberals as the enemy, instead of people with different ideas. In the way John McCain would talk about it, Gingrich taught people to talk about liberals as the absolute enemy. They were the new, enemy we had to defeat and totally purge. So you've got a lot of Republicans who don't want to vote Republican. I mean, don't want to vote Democrat at all, ever, because they've been trained that way, because they fear the other side so much. And that's an unfortunate thing right now, because it used to be you'd have more people elected to Congress who were closer to the middle because they could get votes from both parties. It makes these things easier to get done. Especially the Republican Party has become very parliamentary party, where you have the leadership directing what the members do. That's not the way American politics used to be. Let me segue from that, Suzanne, into the question that was raised about the upper Midwest, because that kind of goes to the logic people were thinking. There's a really good piece by Tim Alberta right after the election. He writes for Politico about the upper Midwest states, so Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. And he said that Democrats did exactly what they needed to do. They were trying to do three things. They wanted to minimize Trump's margins in the rural areas. And they did. They knocked it down a couple points or more from what it was in 2016. Even as Trump was able to register more people in rural areas, they were able to knock down the percentage. They were able to drive up the urban vote, the minority vote especially, but the urban vote in, say Detroit and Milwaukee. And that's what the Clinton campaign had not done enough. And so they were able to basically, do something like Obama had done in his elections. And then finally, I think most importantly, there's a lot of talk about suburban women in the suburbs. If you looked outside Milwaukee and the Philadelphia areas, those suburbs turned against Trump dramatically. I mean, there was like a 20-point difference. They had gone 10 point, I'm generalizing, 10 points to Trump before. This time there were 10 points against. And that was educated, high-income people of both sexes, right? Who decided, we're not going to do this. I would suspect some of them did the ticket splitting further down, but I don't know how many. But I think those three things, the Biden campaign was able to do those three things. And in the future, what they need to do is they're going to have to win Texas and win more of these states. They're going to have to do better in the rural areas. They're going to have to go organize, which is what the Republicans followed the Barack Obama, organizing methods in the Rio Grande Valley. They did the hard work. They said, we've only got 10% of the vote. Let's get it to 30%, right? And the Democrats have to go in the red counties in Texas and these other places and do the same.
Okay, right. Well, I was going to ask you what you thought the Democrats should do. So thank you for that. Could we talk a little bit about the polls, about survey research here? We got a couple of questions about that. One question had to do with, actually it came to me in the context of the Black vote. We had a concerned citizen who was so surprised that 12% of Blacks were reportedly voting for Trump, Black males, sorry, that he asked this question. Who are these pollsters asking? Are they just looking at exit polls? There are a lot of people that vote by mail. There's a lot of people that vote late. How should we trust what the pollsters are telling us now about who did what?
Right. Well, first I'll segue into that by about the black men voting. Trump did have a good commercial and a good record that he was able to boast. I have signed something about, black civil rights and police, actions and so forth, the police reform bill. And here, my opponent, Mr. Biden, he had been about, the super predators and the tough on crime legislation in the past. So some people heard that, right? On the polling itself, what's happened in part is that polling is much tougher now to get right. It was easier 20 years ago because it's harder to get people on the home phone. You've got the mobile phones, you've got the millennials, you're trying to reach them. How many people can you reach? So pollsters, and it costs money to do polls. They're not able to get the returns that they used to get. And that means when you can't get as many returns, then your formula that you kind of, tease things out with, it's kind of an art and a science. And I think they got caught by that, and I just heard several pollsters just saying it's more difficult than it used to be. You have to be careful. You have to know where your numbers are coming from. And it's easy, given this. What's another thing? The other thing is that's going on with these national polls is that some of the right wingers do not trust institutions, and they certainly don't trust the liberal media, so-called. And so if they get a call from MSNBC, Wall Street Journal, or whatever, or CBS or the Washington Post, they'll probably just hang up. And so we're not capturing those voters in the selection, right? They are selecting out. But then come election day, they go and vote, and we're not ready for that. And somehow the campaigns have been able to adjust for that, but the public polls have not caught up. I mean, my first book is partially a critique. It's called Saving Democracy. It's partially a critique of public polling the way it's done now. I argue that we should have. It's like a reform that's based off of Jefferson and Madison kind of combined. It's thinking that Madison said we could have representative government, right? But when we started with representative government, we had 1 to 30,000 districts for Congress. Now there's 750,000 to 800 people. That's crazy. Jefferson, on the other hand, wanted ward democracy. He wanted kind of small, groups, kind of town hall democracy like he saw in New England. My thought is, why don't you have a third venue at the local level? You could have city councils, school boards, you could have a local legislative assembly. That could be people that are, picked by lot. They don't have to run for office, and they serve maybe a year or two on this panel, and they look at the biggest issues affecting California or the biggest issues affecting, the new administration, and they focus on that, and they spend some time, and you poll them at the beginning, and you poll them after 2 or 3 months, and you see where they are. And I would bet there would be times when their views on, like, what should we do? Should we do Obamacare or not? Would be quite different than the public polling. And those polls would be accurate. You would be getting a sample of kind of super citizens who decided to take some time. Some people, like the concerned citizens, that would say, yeah, I'd be happy to do that for a couple of years. I'll pay attention. We'll be online helping research stuff, and we'll have meetings every 2 weeks, and then we'll get together and we'll vote on something. It's kind of out of, the way democracy worked back in Athens. We could add that. That's something we don't have in American democracy now.
Right. Well, we certainly don't. We have the Electoral College when it comes to the president, right? Well, let me ask you just one last question about the polling, which actually is my question or crossed my mind, and that is that maybe we're both just going to say yes to this, but I want to share the idea. If we look at Trump's approval ratings over the 4 years of his presidency, they average about 41%. Yeah. But he actually got 47% of the popular vote. So we could interpret this one of two ways. We could interpret this as evidence that pollsters all along have been getting his approval ratings wrong, kind of what you just pointed out, that right-wing people are less likely to answer, or maybe they're more shy about admitting their preference. And that's been true. So while all of us have been thinking, at best 40% of Americans support Trump, we've been wrong.
Yeah.
Alternatively, the events of the last 6 weeks or so, the Black Lives Matter, the violence in the cities, brought about some kind of a change such that there was a surge in Trumpian support at the end. Would you comment on what your thoughts might be?
I think both of those are probably right to a certain degree. I would bet that the public polls, I think there's a little bit of embarrassment. It could be from both ends. It might not be the hardcore reactionaries. They would not want to take the call from the polls. But other people would say, approve, disapprove, and they're talking to this person. They might not want to say that they actually approve of Trump. I have a lot of people I've experienced, and you guys have too, where somebody will say, I don't like Trump, but I like his policies. Right. And I was on a call with somebody a couple of weeks ago, and I was trying to say, okay, what policies do you like? Right. Tell me exactly which policies you like. Other people will say, I disapprove of him, but the economy. A lot of reporters came to that. They could go through a whole litany about why are you going to stay with Trump? Are you going to stay with Trump? And then the bottom line down at the end was kind of like, I think he's better on the economy, and I'm happy with that. And I can overlook stuff. So now the bad part in terms of this reactionary situation we're in is Biden took a chance in this election, running a campaign a little bit like Hillary about character. He broadened it to say it's the character of the country that's on the ballot, right? This is about a campaign about election, about the nation's soul. This is about what we are. Are we a democracy? We have to, pull it together to say we are, because this president, he knows no boundaries. He'll do whatever he wants. And so the disturbing thing was, and a lot of people have noticed this, is like, okay, so in 2016, the people that voted for him had seen him as, this celebrity star, and they heard the border message on, I want to stop immigration, and they wanted to stop abortion and his court picks, and they said all this, okay, I'll go with him. I'll take a, maybe he can do it. I don't like the Chinese on trade. Let's see how he does, right? And then after, 4 years of what we saw, which was, just everything bad, right? From the racism to the bowing to Putin. You put everything together, and it's kind of like, it's like these people who voted for Trump, now we're saying 48%, they voted for Trump, and they had a test drive of 4 years, and they said, yeah, I like that car.
11 million people, 11 million more people voted. I just checked that before this broadcast.
Yeah.
He got 11 million more votes in 2020 than he got in 2016.
Right. And so that just says we're in this really dangerous situation. So to say one more thing on my book, what I found when I took American politics and put it into a comparative perspective, it's that you get really bad authoritarianism in Latin America or Europe when the folks who are on the landed estates, right, the plantation owners, when those people would make an alliance with commercial capital. And in Latin America, right, the industrial magnates were not that big. It was basically the landed families, and they could block liberal change. Like a lot of Latin American countries never got democracy fully established. Chile was like the lone exception that had democracy for a long, long time, until Allende was the unfortunate situation that we helped depose him. And if you look to Europe, it's like the fate of the landed elite is the key to whether a country will remain committed to democracy or is open to the voices of authoritarianism. In France, the aristocracy, the landed elite are eliminated in the revolution. In England, they marry into the commercial class, and they gradually become very devoted to democracy, such that Churchill fights the fascists, right? In Germany is the terrible case where the Prussian landed elite, called the Junkers with a J, they never liked the Weimar Republic. They cooperated with other conservatives when when Hitler did not have near enough support politically to get power. And they made a deal because all the conservatives and Hitler's party, the Nazis, hated the Weimar Republic, and they came together, and the Junkers were part of that coalition. And so they stabbed democracy in the heart, and Hitler got his chance. So in our country, we've never had these two threads joined together. We avoided it in the Civil War because the Rockefellers, the industrial elite, were part of the North, and the land barons in the South were defeated. In the New Deal era, we pushed back with the New Deal, and the remnants of the plantation elite run the South, but they're part of the Democratic Party. Only post 60s do the two sides come together, and only post Gingrich have they totally taken charge of the Republican Party. And we see where that lies. I mean, we're in a situation where the Republican Party, as it is now, is quite open to authoritarianism, which is really unfortunate. And your point about 11 million more people voting for Trump, for whatever their reasons were, show how open the country is to taking a dangerous, horrible turn toward worse.
I see. Okay, well, you are kind of frightening us. I guess that is the sentiment you have. There isn't probably much positive in the news, but let me just ask you, would you hazard any predictions about the outcome of the Georgia runoff? Everyone seems to have their eye on the Georgia runoff as a possible hope, but you've been talking so much about the South. Maybe talking a little bit about Georgia would be appropriate.
Right. I think the thing that was really promising in the election was, Virginia wasn't even talked about. In old elections, Virginia would have been the swing state. Virginia's in the blue category now because of the suburbs around Washington, D.C. North Carolina's been on the knife's edge. The Democrats can't quite get there, but they've been close. And now Georgia all of a sudden has come together because the metropolitan area of Atlanta has boomed. And it's interesting. I didn't know this until I was reading about Martin Luther King recently, that Atlanta has a different racial history than any other major city. That there was a kind of middle class, hard to call them an elite, but the middle class that Martin Luther King's family was part of. They were big enough and important enough in Atlanta such that how should I put this? Usually you have an inner city and then the richer suburbs outside. So the ghettos in the middle. And in Atlanta, the whites had one half of that. So they had a white underclass, and then the rich side. The blacks had an inner city, and then they had a more affluent side. So that the politics of Atlanta and the geography's always been a little different than other places in America. So Atlanta has, blossomed, and they've had more immigrants, northern people
Black
coming.
Immigrants too.
Right. They've had, it's boomed and it's changed. So it's promising that Georgia and Arizona are going to be increasingly in the blue camp. And that's the key. If the Democrats can make some breakthroughs in the South, and the South doesn't hold a grip on the Electoral College like it has. The old playbook of Wallace and Trump was to take the solid South. And for years, we thought we'd gotten away from that because there were biracial coalitions that elected Carter and Clinton and a guy named Milbus in Mississippi, like a Democrat won in Mississippi. Wow. And it was because enough whites voted with the blacks, right? And that's ebbed. That went down in the 90s and through the 2000s, so that Alabama was a really interesting case. They were still a Democratic legislature until 2010. And it was like having Obama's election and then Hillary later was too much for people in the Hill Country. Like the Hill Country in Alabama, the northern part of the state, not very many blacks. People are racist, but not nearly as much as the people in the black areas. And they reacted to Obama and Hillary. But But now, in these metropolitan areas, there's a pushback, in terms of numbers. And so we don't know, what's going to happen with the Georgia Senate races. It's really confused whether Trump will go and do successful campaigning for these two senators, whether the Democrats can get out the same coalition that they had before. I'm not totally pessimistic on where we are. I think that it's a real fight. I think, that we have to push ahead, and we're going to have to do some stuff about talking about racial issues in the country. And what Trump has done is it's like, I think one way to think of this is that people as individuals have different identities that can be prompted by politics, right? So you could have a working class guy up in Michigan whose family was always a New Deal Democrat, right, all the way through. But then the Democrats hadn't been able to, or hadn't either not focused on, or hadn't been able to get enough done in terms of deindustrialization and helping that family out. And identities shift from union to, okay, I'll listen to kind of the Trump argument, and I'll become a more populist argument, and I'll be open to pitches that are about white identity politics, right? Not all those people who have, I think bottom line of the Trump vote, that 11 million people, and all those people who say, yeah, I've done in the test drive, I'll do it again. Bottom line, a lot of this is white identity politics, the protection of white privilege at a deep, sometimes almost unconscious level, that I don't want things to change so much. It's okay to have a few minorities and women in power, but I don't want to open up too much. And so Trump's a safer bet to hold on to my privilege. The Democrats have to, talk through this thing, and have to have some, messaging and spokespersons who can talk to people who are open to hearing messages from both parties. They've been activated by the Trump stuff about immigration, and his immigration stuff was always about racism. It was always, he just generalized George Wallace to everybody else. Wallace was all about blacks, but he talked about anti-government as a way to talk in code about that. So I think it's doable, and I think the climate change situation, especially with young people, is going to make politics change faster than we think over this next decade. That's going to accelerate stuff, because the younger generation is going to come out about racial justice and about climate change. So it's good that Biden has that included in his 4 points about the economy. And I think the idea of trying to talk about the climate situation with a Green New Deal is a smart way to go to appeal to people on the economic stuff, because that's usually at the forefront in an election. So the Democrats, it's promising. It's not bleak. It's just hard. That's how I would close.
All right. Well, I'm afraid we're about out of time. I was going to ask you, but you more or less replied in terms of what the Democrats might want to do, or how they can move things forward. So, Concerned Citizens thanks you, Kevin O'Leary, for taking time from your busy schedule to talk with us. To be sure, in the days ahead, more information about the election will become available. But despite what we may still learn, we do appreciate Dr. O'Leary's thoughtful and thorough analysis. And Concerned Citizens much appreciates you, our viewers, for taking the time to watch this show. As long as the lockdown persists, Concerned Citizens Presents will offer programs for your in-house enjoyment. Stay safe and tune in next time. Don't forget, here's your chance to learn more about Dr. O'Leary's thinking in this book, 2020, just published, Madison Sorrow.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been nice to be with you. Thanks so much.
Okay.
All right.